We will be picking up on Chapter 25 of Bitten, The Secret History of Lyme Disease and Biological Weapons by Kris Newby. Chapter 25, Collateral Damage. Hamilton, Montana, 1983. It is now clear that Borrelia burgdorferi can persist within the nervous system for years, causing progressive illness, and increasing evidence also suggests that the spirochete can remain latent there for years before producing clinical symptoms. Willy Burgdorfer, the brain involvement in Lyme disease. During the first quarter of 1983, Willy was busier than ever with his Lyme research and fielding questions from scientists around the world. On Sunday in March, he went to the lab to clean the cages of his test rabbits. The rabbits had been inoculated with cultured spirochetes, and now ticks were being allowed to feed on the animals to prevent the ticks from escaping. The rabbits' wire cages had been mounted over large porcelain trays filled with water. These trays had to be cleaned daily with boiling water, but because it was his lab's technician's day off, Willy had to do it. While he was rinsing off one of the trays in the sink, Lyme-infected rabbit urine splashed into his eyes. A few weeks later, on April 13th, he noticed five Lyme bullseye rashes under his armpit and his torso. The family physician diagnosed the rashes as an internal reaction to Lyme disease infection. After tests for fungi came back negative, the lab was unable to isolate an infectious organism from Willy's blood or from a skin biopsy. Here's a picture of what Mr. Burgdorfer had. Willy took a tetracycline antibiotic for 20 days before the rash disappeared. He sent a letter to Alan Steary at Yale asking for treatment advice, always the meticulous scientist. He included a detailed sketch of his rashes, which looked very similar to those on his infected rabbits. When his Lyme antibody test came back negative, Willy's co-workers were divided on whether he truly had Lyme disease. Co-discoverer Alan Barbour, who had been trained as a physician, thought the rashes looked like ringworm fungal infection. Willy insisted it was Lyme disease, explaining that the Lyme antibody test was negative only because his early dose of antibiotics may have halted the immune system reaction the test measured. The lesions resembled the initial skin reaction reported for Lyme disease. He wrote, even through serological evaluation and attempts to isolate from blood or skin biopsy the causative agent, there appears to be no doubt at the diagnosis. Past experience has shown that patients with initial Lyme disease manifestations, lesions, do not convert serologically when treated early with antibiotics. In a 1983 letter, Willy had told the NIH that he never missed a day of work because of the infection. But he retired 3 years later on January 1986 at age 61. He told his son Carl that he had retired to spend more time with Dale, who was having ongoing health issues. The NIH granted him emeritus status, which enabled him to continue his research and train younger scientists. For the next few years, he traveled all over giving talks on Lyme disease. He would go on to be listed as an author on 106 publications from 1982 to 1993. Yet despite receiving the accolades he'd always longed for, he looked unhappy in many of the photographs taken after the discovery. In 1993, he was officially credited with the discovery of the European strain of Swiss agent called Rickettsia helvetia, a name derived from Helvetia, a braided armor warrior goddess of Switzerland. The same woman embossed on the flipped Swiss franc that had so long ago sent Willie to Montana. One day, Dale was vacuuming behind the couch in their family room when she tripped and hit her head on a large bronze sculpture of a Native American warrior. She developed a brain aneurysm and had a stroke on the operating table. My wife had to undergo brain surgery to remove subdural blood clots, Willie wrote to a colleague on October 4th, 2000. During this emergency procedure, she suffered a stroke that left her partially paralyzed and requires intensive rehabilitation and care that has limited my professional activities. Dale never fully recovered, and she died on March 13th, 2005. Before she died, Willie told Pam Weintraub, the journalist, that Dale had said, "Lyme disease killed me," perhaps referring to the toll that Willie's dedication to science had taken on her and the family. 2 years after Dale's death, Louise, a former neighbor, friend, and longtime admirer, now divorced, returned to Hamilton after 15 years away and started chatting with Willie while he was outside on his hands and knees pulling weeds. They began seeing each other, and 6 months later, in 2007, they married and had a happy number of years together. Willie died from complications of Parkinson's disease on November 17th, 2014. Before he died, I asked him if he thought that Lyme disease had caused his Parkinson's symptoms. He shrugged and said, "Ask the doctors." On September 25th, 2015, 11 months after Willie died, Louise, his second wife, invited Ron Lindorf to collect a few more documents that Willie had wanted to add to the online archive being set up at a Utah Valley University in Orem. Lindorf wrote from Utah to Montana on his Lindorf rode from Utah to Montana on his Suzuki Bandit 1250 motorcycle. He sent me a picture of himself, blonde-haired, slick-back, wearing Ray-Ban sunglasses, motorcycle leathers, and a pearly white Cheshire Cat grin. He looked like the most badass Mormon I'd ever seen. When he arrived in Hamilton, Louise directed him to a flower print letter box in Willie's garage office. A yellow sticky note on top read, "I wonder why somebody didn't do something." Then I realized that I am somebody. The message was in Willie's distinctive handwriting, in the red felt pen he always used when he wanted to highlight something important. It seemed like a message from the grave. Lindorf strapped the box to his motorcycle and rode back to Utah. A few days later, he sent me a picture of an item from it, another receipt from the Swiss bank account Willie had opened in 1974. Paul and I flew back to Orem to look over the new documents. Beside the new bank receipt, there were records of multiple life insurance policies. It looked as if the policies had been drawn up in the late 1970s, at a time when Willie, with 2 kids in college and a wife, in and out of mental institutions, was bleeding cash. There was also a linen-bound bookkeeping ledger. Willie had started right after the Swiss bank account was opened. Its entries stopped the year he retired in 1986, and there was a 2006 prenuptial contract that included a statement of Willie's net worth, compiled by his 2 sons, Bill, a CPA in Montana, and Carl, a private asset manager at a bank in Oregon. At first glance, it looked as if Willie's net worth was more than he could have accumulated from this NIH salary alone. He had no known inheritance or wealthy relatives. Still, it was hard to draw any conclusions based on the limited information I had. Later, I would interview his heirs and call in forensic accountants to help. In addition, he hadn't listed all his life insurance policies in the prenup. Then there was the comment that Louise made to Lindorf about the first time she gained access to Willie's bank accounts following his death. She said that he had a hidden account that no one in his family knew about. "There was more money in that bank than you and I will see in our lifetime," she told Lindorf. I left Utah wondering about the Swiss bank account where Willie had gotten the money and what exactly his sticky note confession meant. In October 2018, Louise Bergdorfer picked me up at the Bitterroot Inn in her SUV to take me on an insider's driving tour of Hamilton. I asked her to show me some of the important landmarks in Willie's life. She was in her mid-70s with red hair, freckles, and hazel eyes. I met her during my last trip and had found her to be friendly and helpful. She was a retired English as a second language teacher and the former wife of a Lutheran pastor. She had adopted 3 multiracial children during her previous marriage, and she loved dogs. The highway through Hamilton was lined with cafes, casinos, gun, pawn shops, and stores that catered to the construction trades. I glimpsed farm fields dotted with golden wheels of hay in the wide valley to the east. The Rocky Mountain Lab dominated the skyline at the edge of the residential area. With the addition of a bio-level 4 lab, security measures had been enhanced. There were surveillance cameras on the perimeter, security patrols, and black spiked steel fence line with giant boulders positioned to keep terrorist vehicles from knocking it down. Louise showed me the white steepled church where Willie and Dale were married. Where Willie and Dale were married. Where did I get I from? And where he had served as a lay minister. I saw Miss Kraken's boarding house for single scientists and the fields where Willie coached youth soccer. Louis described how he would bicycle up and down the streets shouting into a bullhorn to promote the Kiwanis Club annual pancake breakfast fundraiser. She and I stopped for a slice of cherry pie at his favorite restaurant, the Coffee Cup. Louis was a compassionate caregiver to Willie as he became increasingly debilitated from Parkinson's disease and diabetes. His sons, one in Eugene, Oregon, and the other in Dillon, Montana, rarely visited him in his later years. Over our many conversations, I'd grown to appreciate Louis' contributions to Willie's life. Louis also took me to Willie's grave at Riverside Cemetery on the edge of town. It looked like a farmer's field, its modest headstones planted like a row of corn. Its modest headstones planted like rows of corn. Willie's grave marker was carved out of rose granite, set flush to the ground. His name was on the left side and Louise was on the right. Her date of death was blank. Then we drove a short distance to look at Dale's headstone. It was located in her pioneer family's plot, next to that of her mother, Miss Minnie C., and beneath Minnie's favorite genus of a tree, a maple. Favorite genus of a tree, a maple. Mine too. Before Louise dropped me back at my hotel, she confessed that shortly after her wedding, Willie had told her about his 2 visits by government agents. She said that the agents had questioned him about virulent pathogens missing from his lab, about the ones that the Russians stole. Don't be stupid. Don't be surprised if you get a visit from the State Department too, he said to Louise. He didn't provide her with any details beyond that. I was never able to confirm the Fed's visit to Willie's despite interviews many of his lab coworkers and filing Freedom of Information requests with the FBI, State Department, the CDC, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I requested visitor logs from the Rocky Mountain Lab, but was told they were destroyed after 5 years, in keeping with the lab's document retention policy. Willie Bergdorfer's technique for allowing vials of hungry ticks to feed on lab mice. Nazi stuff. Chapter 26, Discovery, Palo Alto, California, 2016. Researchers said they believed they had discovered the cause of Lyme disease, an illness that became a disturbing medical mystery when it was first identified in Connecticut 7 years ago. Jane E. Brody, New York Times, November 18, 1982. In the summer of 2016, I sat in my home office and looked out over my 38 document boxes, 50-plus reference books, and piles of loose paper, all tagged with confetti-colored sticky notes. I now had more Willy Bergdorfer documentation than the National Archives. According to Willy, the Lyme disease outbreak was somehow related to a bioweapons release. Now I needed to figure out how to prove or disprove this claim. In my last interview with him in 2013, Willy thought he was doing me a favor when he said, "The evidence is all in the literature. Just read my papers." Easier said than done, given that he published more than 200 articles, all of which were difficult to comprehend if you didn't have a PhD in microbiology or entomology. After years of research, I'd sifted through his papers and read through dozens of histories written by Lyme's discoverers, researchers, and journalists, but also solo investigators. I knew I was at risk of research overload and falling in love with my own theories. Up until this point, I'd kept the story under the radar. Now I knew I needed to call in someone to independently examine my assumptions and conclusions. So I pitched the story to Kris, at the time an investigative journalist with STAT, a health-focused news organization produced by Boston Globe Media. He now works for Science Magazine. I first met Pillar in 2013 during a talk at the Investigative Reporters and Editors Annual Conference. At the time, he was working on the Sacramento Bee story about the flawed corroded bolts in the new eastern span of the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge. The story took years to research and required technical analysis of about 100,000 pages of documentation. Pillar also had a deep knowledge of biological warfare, having written the book Gene Wars, Military Control Over the New Genetic Technologies. I thought he might be a good collaborator down the road, and 3 years later he sat in my office ready to hear Willy's story. I need to get that book. If Pillar were a dog, he'd be a Doberman. He is intense, intelligent, and slightly intimidating. He set the ground rules for our interaction. If he decided to take on the story, I had to hand over all irrelevant documents, and I wouldn't see the final story until it came out in print. He started by grilling me like a suspect source, trying to assess my reliability. I gave him an overview of the story and the evidence. I gave him an overview of the story and the evidence, and he left to pitch the story to his editors. A week or so later, we struck a deal. He'd research, write, and publish the story under his byline. In exchange, I'd get my Swiss agent theories independently vetted. We both hoped that the story would motivate a whistleblower to come forward. On October 12, 2016, Pillar published an excellent long-form article, The Swiss Agent. Long-forgotten research unearths new mystery about Lyme disease, with STAT and in the Boston Globe. Pillar's interpretation of the Swiss Agent was similar to mine, as summarized in his article's introduction. As scientists who worked with Bergdorfer and reviewed key portions of the document at STAT's request, said that bacteria might still be sickening an unknown number of Americans today. While the evidence is hardly conclusive, patients and doctors might be mistaking under-the-radar Swiss agent infections for Lyme, the infectious disease specialist said.
Callie, come here. Come.
Callie, come here. Come on. Or bacteria could be co-infecting Lyme patients, exacerbating symptoms and complicating their treatment, and even stoking bitter debate about whether Lyme often becomes a persistent and serious illness. Hi. Pillar's interview with Alan Steary, John Banach, John Anderson, and Andrew Main, scientists central to Lyme discovery, didn't shed any new light on the mystery. The researchers didn't remember why the Swiss agent USA had disappeared from view, but most admitted that such a rickettsia could be complicating illness for Lyme patients. It is interesting to note that Andrew Main, a young postdoc at the time of the Swiss agent USA discovery, had tested positive for the Swiss agent antibodies midway through the investigation, according to Willie's lab notes, but Main had never been told this. Pillar also phoned Paul Mead, chief of epidemiology and surveillance for the CDC's Lyme disease program, who said he'd never heard about the Swiss agent. No whistleblowers came forward after the publication, but I felt certain the article would certainly pique the curiosity of some microbiologist somewhere in the world, and progress would be made. Toward the end of my investigation, I re-examined the history of Lyme disease through the eyes of an arson investigator, standing knee-deep in the ashes of a bioweapons program. The first thing I noticed was that the outbreak began earlier than most people realized. In the late 1960s, when the military was conducting many open-air tests of aerosolized bacteria and aggressive Lone Star ticks, Polly Murray, the Connecticut mother who first started documenting cases of Lyme disease, wrote that she first developed swollen knees and severe headaches in the spring of 1967. Shortly after the virus decimated the nearby Long Island duck industry, when Murray visited her doctor, and asked if her illness could have been caused by ticks, he said Rocky Mountain spotted fever does not present with the kind of symptoms you're having. Alan Steary from Yale University didn't begin investigating cases around old Lyme until 1975, and in his first articles on Lyme arthritis, he noted that one man's symptoms started as early as 1968. 4 more cases were identified in eastern Connecticut beginning in 1972. Willie's involvement in the outbreaks began in the summer of 1975 with a 3-week trip to Nantucket, Cape Cod, and Martha's Vineyard. That year, 9 people on Nantucket came down with babesiosis, and a few people on Martha's Vineyard fell ill with Rocky Mountain spotted fever. 1 person died. Willie's investigation was interrupted by his Swiss tick collecting trip in 1978, and upon his return he began analyzing Joe Banach's Long Island ticks. That's when he recognized that there was something different about the rickettsia he was seeing. Under a microscope they looked like spotted fever rickettsia, but they didn't show up on the standard tests, and they didn't always cause the expected pinprick rashes. These rickettsia caused spot-free spotted fever. Why did Willie go on an NIH-funded Swiss sabbatical in the middle of the United States rickettsial outbreaks? And why did the newly discovered Long Island rickettsia test positive to the European Swiss agent tests? The answer unknown. Based on his letters to Steary, Banach, and others in 1979, Willie seemed convinced that the new rickettsia could be a causative agent of Lyme disease. This possibility was reflected in a project report from the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, the NIAID, Fauci's department. For the period ending in September 30th, 1979, only R. rickettsii thus far had been etiologically associated with human illness, and indications are that the other 3 are virulent for man, as well for experimenting animals. Although tantalizing evidence based on serologic responses in residents from Long Island and California suggests that inapparent or missed infection may sometimes occur, there was nothing in the official NIH progress report of 1979 and 1980 about the Long Island and Connecticut blood samples testing positive for European Swiss agent antigens. And in the 1979 report, Willie wrote the Swiss agent is pathogenic to meadow voles, chick embryos, and several lines of tissue culture cells, but not for guinea pigs. A finding that contradicted later claims that it was harmless. It was in the beginning of 1980, 2 years before the first Lyme spirochetes were found. The Swiss agent USA disappeared. This about face coincided with a series of discussions Willie had with an old bioweapons developer on the Rickettsia Commission of the Armed Forces Epidemiological Board. As recorded in his personal phone log, these scientists were most certainly familiar with the secret history of incapacitating rickettsia and viral agent testing, and they may have discussed with Willie the possibility of there having been an undisclosed field test in the Long Island region. His on-the-record timeline of the Lyme spirochete discovery didn't start until October 1981 with when George Bannock sent a new batch of Shelter Island deer ticks to him. That's when Willie found parasitic roundworm larvae in the main body cavity of 2 of the ticks. They were similar to the deer worms he'd found in ticks in 1978 in his 1978 trip to Switzerland, and similar to roundworms that Sonnenschein and the Naval Research Unit in Cairo had worked with for a project exploring the relatively new field of endoparasitic transmission of disease agents. These experiments, multiple disease agents were put inside mosquito-borne roundworms, according to an NIH research report from 1961. When Willie dissected 124 more Shelter Island deer ticks, 98% had new rickettsia in them, and only 60% carried the new spirochetes. Willie thought that either microbe might be causing Lyme disease, but for unknown reasons this alternative theory fell into a black hole. I discovered an early draft of Willie's Lyme discovery article for Science that confirms his concern that the rickettsia could be contributing to what we call Lyme disease. I'll pick this up inside.